I'll show you in a minute some of the questions we're going to focus on. But before we get into it, because we are going to really get into the system and the classes and sort of the academic outcomes and how they fit into a culture, and even thinking a little bit about questions of what here can and can't we learn from Japanese education that might affect our practice, both in terms of if you're in the classroom, what are some things to think about, not to sort of cut and paste into your classroom, but that might make you think about your own practice or your own school practice and what really is not relevant. But also if you want to teach about Japan, what is relevant that you can learn today. Before we get into that, one of the reasons I like to throw this picture up at the front is if you look at it, you see a lot of things. You see forefront a lot of kids, a lot of smiles, they're little kids. And what you probably notice if you took a lot of time to look at this is you only see one adult with a lot of little kids and a lot of playground equipment. And this is kind of quintessential Japanese education in many ways. Not that the teachers don't play a role, they play a really strong role. But there's a degree actually in some ways of independence that is taught to Japanese kids from a young age. That is a large part of the education. Is I think it's really important us to think about not just like what are the textbooks, what is the sort of outward curriculum, but what is the soft curriculum? What is the pedagogy? Not just in terms of how is the classroom run, but how is supervision and how are schools thought about? So I'm going to start with a story that is sort of reflective of this picture. In my role here, I got to take a group of our students over to Japan for 2 weeks. It was about 2.5 weeks this summer. And as part of that, a really important highlight is we went and visited the schools. And we were visiting, it's actually this elementary school that you see the front, well, it's an elementary school right near where I took this picture. And we went to see a physical education class. Firstly, the physical education class was being taught by the third grade teachers, not by a phys ed teacher, because everybody who's an elementary teacher is supposed to have sort of a broad understanding of how to teach. And towards the end of the class, there was a moment that was really shocking for my students. The kids were running around, putting away some gymnastics equipment, and one kid ran into another kid, fell on the floor, and the kid is crying, like crying hard. And the teachers just stand there, and I just stand there. And about 5 of the kids were looking at me with horrified looks on their faces. How can they just stand here and do nothing while this child is crying? And what happened was an amazing thing. The other third graders in the class walked over and took care of the child, saw if they'd be okay. Of course, the teachers were looking to make sure there was no major injury, right? We got to be reasonable here. And the child was able to get up, was able to stop crying, was soothed by the other children, and then got up and finished and helped finish cleaning up the equipment. Of course, then the teachers came over just to make sure there was no real injury. And the day went on. And I just highlight this story, even though I think you're going to see more of this type of thing in the film and these questions in the film, is that part of what I'm going to talk about, or a lot of what I'm going to talk about, are the systems and the textbooks and how teaching is done and things of that. But it's really important to think about it in terms of also what is the mindset of the school? How are things like resilience taught? How are things like independence taught? How are things like relationships between adults and children taught? Responsibility between children and the group. If you are in a Japanese class, and I think this is an important point, is anyone who's ever lived in Japan for an extended period of time and gone to school, anyone who went to Japanese school would know these 3 terms. Kiritsu, which basically means stand up, they, which means bow, and chakuseki, which means sit down. Now, less so now than 30 years ago, where it was done every day, but at least usually once a week and often every day in a class. Japanese classes will start this way, where a teacher will walk in, the kids are in the room before the teacher, and a student whose job is to start the class will call out in a loud voice, and every student will take a turn doing this at some point during the year, and say, Kiritsu, they, chakuseki. And that's how the classes begin. And that's also how the classes will end. The reason I highlight this, I mean, there's a few things. One, I think you're going to see more in your film is the idea of there's obviously cultural messages that is sent in starting a class this way, in terms of relations between the student and the teacher, in terms of responsibility for how a classroom is run, including the kids taking a lot of responsibility. But the other part, and I think this is something applicable, is something I think about a lot in my current role. I thought a lot in my career in talking to teachers who are at different stages of their career, is most people, especially if you've been teaching a long time, if you've taught in any area where classroom management might be a challenge, you know that one good way to create good classroom management is if you make the simple stuff very routinized. so that you're not having to figure, every teacher doesn't have to figure out how to do everything their own way. And in Japan, of course, every teacher has a certain amount of creativity, and it's not that every classroom runs and teaches every lesson the same way. That's not the case at all. But there are certain ways that classes are run that every class in Japan pretty much will run the same way. There's certain ways of just carrying out basic procedures where every teacher doesn't create it their own way. And that creates a certain routine that helps, especially what I would argue is the weaker teachers and some of the weaker students to function at a higher level. So that, as all of you have taught a long time know, giving a signal that it's time to sit down and start class, giving a signal that it's time to end class, and know that between those two signals, you're supposed to be focused. That's a big thing that every first-year teacher in Japan on their first day actually already will know how to do, and it's going to be reinforced in every other class. So thinking about things like that, simple things like how do you hand in the homework? All these things are routinized, right? I throw that in. These are maybe just some things for you to think about as you see the film. I'm not going to talk much about them here. The other thing I would throw in is whenever I take teachers to Japan, and I've taken teachers to Japan many times and students, and you ask them, well, what surprises you? What do you think you'd most like to take back to your own school? They'll usually say two things. One, I'm going to show a picture later that you'll probably see, is the school lunches, which doesn't happen at every school, but the part they like about the school lunches is the school lunches are made by someone else, but they're put together and run often by the kids, and the cleanup is done by the kids. The kids have a lot of control over there. And school cleanup time, which is, and this is every school in Japan, is the kids will have a cleaning time every day, and the kids will actually clean and take responsibility for the school. And again, these are just things I think you're going to see a lot of this in the film to think about, so I won't focus there. Something else, I'm not going to show you this. There's something in Japan called Rajio Taiso, which I think, again, you'll probably see in the film. This is, again, something I think just to think about. I'm not going to show you the video, but it's a basic standard exercise program that they don't really do in the higher schools anymore, but all the elementary school students in Japan will do this. They'll even do it during summer vacation. And the idea here is not just thinking about physical education, but it's thinking about standard activities that every student in Japan is going to do, and also times to put movement into the day. As a quick tip, if you just put Rajio Taiso into your YouTube search bar, something will come up, and if you click this video is actually watchable on YouTube. I'm not going to play it for you today in the interest of time. Is after like a long testing period or something like this, even with seniors in high school, this is actually not a bad activity. It's 3 minutes, gets them up and moving in a specific way, teaches a little bit of rhythm, a little bit of Japanese counting, and then gets people refocused. All right, big thing I'm going to do is the key questions we're going to look at today. What is it that Japanese children learn in school? And here, mostly I'm going to focus on the outward curriculum, not the softer things that I was just talking about, although I would argue those softer things are very, very important. I don't know if they're just as important as the academic curriculum, but they're very important. How do Japanese children learn? In other words, what are the methods? And how is education and schooling structured in Japan? And then, time permitting, how do these educational practices fit into the larger context of Japanese society? And I'll do these things more or less in order. To get started, though, I'm not going to click over and show you. I'll put these links up so that you can see them. I believe these links can be made available to you as well. Maybe Yumi can send them out, or you can just Google them. Is something called PISA, which is a test many of you are familiar with. It helps shape in some ways the way that upper level policymakers in Japan often think about the effectiveness of Japanese education as an academic institution. It's an international test. It tests reading, math, science. It does a variety of other things, run by the OECD. And it's done every number of years, and almost every major industrialized nation participates. It's not made as big a deal of in the United States. In Japan, it's made a fairly big deal of, especially by the Ministry of Health, Education, Sports, and Culture. The latest results are in 2022. We can go back and forth. It's not the point of today as to the utility and maybe some issues with the test, but looking at it broadly in terms of where nations are falling, it gives you a broad idea of the academic skills of a broad group of students in the schools. And what you'll see in 2022 is in science, in reading, in math, Japan was somewhere between 3 and 5. And I don't think it really matters whether they're 3, 4, or 5, or frankly 5 or 7. But they were in the top portion on the achievement on these tests. And what that indicates to many of the policymakers in Japan, and what it indicates to a lot of scholars, is we can go back and forth like what those rankings means. But it means that on a comparative level amongst amongst a lot of different countries, when Japanese kids graduate high school, whether they are lower achieving students or higher achieving students, their math skills, their reading skills, their science skills on an international standard are actually quite high. And there's a question of how does that happen? And the other thing you'd see, 2022, of course, that would have been taken right after COVID. COVID affected every country in different ways. Japan did have an upswing from the previous tests, and I believe they were 2018 to 2022. Some of that, I think, does relate to the way COVID affected schools in Japan differently than it affected schools in some other countries. But it also reflects a greater sort of swing of development. When I think about schools, and all of you are teachers, I think, can understand that, particularly if you teach elementary school, is students don't show up in the first grade as sort of like these pieces of putty that we can just mold. There's a lot that goes into both their social development, but also their brain development before they ever show up at school. And we can go back and forth as to how much influence that has, but it certainly is going to have an influence on how well they are able to learn math, reading, science, other things once they show up at school, and it can have long-term effects. And I would argue, we go back and forth, but I would argue, and I think a lot of people would agree, that to some extent, we could disagree on the amount, but to some extent, you should start looking, if you want to look at school achievement, start looking at the nutrition and care that the children receive in their prenatal moments. Right? What kind of prenatal care do they receive while they're inside their mother? What kind of nutrition does the mother have? Once they are born, what kind of care do they get from the moment that they're born in terms of medical care, physical care, nutrition, things of that sort, because all of that affects brain development. What I'm showing here is something called the Boshi Techo. This is a very old one. I think they look a little bit different now. But it's something that every mother in Japan will receive for their child, and it includes all their health records. And when you get it from your local government office. It includes things that start with having sort of required prenatal care that you're supposed to get before the baby is born, and then specific times when you're supposed to get care and certain vaccinations and things of that sort when the child is very, very young. And if you don't follow through in providing your child this care, the government actually reaches out. The local government is going to reach out and ask what's going on, so that the percentage of students, I don't have the percentages for you, that children that are receiving proper prenatal and early childhood medical care, nutrition, all these different things, checks, eyesight, hearing, is very, very high. And that is going to affect their school readiness, right? These are just some statistics. I'm not going to go all through them on the health of children. And what we would see is, broadly speaking, across different socioeconomic levels, across different both rural and urban areas, the health of children in Japan is quite high. Part of that's about medical care, part of that's about what goes on in the schools, which very much emphasizes physical health, but also will relate to brain health and brain development. Along with this, popular culture there does help shape children. I won't talk about that too much today. I think you'll hear a little more about that in the film. But certainly there are broad programs in Japan, or whether they be videos, TV, things of that are widely watched by almost all Japanese children, not all. And they do teach some basic skills. They also do teach dance and rhythm and things of that sort. And they do teach values. All right. Pre-K education, we'll sort of briefly stop on. If we go back, you see the picture here. That's what I talk about, the way it is. There's a fair amount of children's education. Pre-K education sort of has two different flavors in Japan, very, very broadly. If you want to specialize, we could go for hours on pre-K education, but in abstract terms, I'd say two broad flavors. There are sort of daycare, and daycare, there are educational aspects to daycare. It's not a preschool in the same sense. There isn't as much focus on curriculum in daycare. Or there is something that is often referred to more as basically more like a nursery school, or sometimes they call it even a kindergarten, where there's a little bit more of an academic curriculum. There's a lot more nuance there. I oversimplified a lot in those. I think the important point, though, in terms of thinking about education in Japan, particularly if we're going to start to think about first grade through 12th grade education, is almost every child in Japan either is in daycare, which is in many ways the way we would often think of certain preschools in the United States, or is in a preschool. So that the rate of preschool education is extraordinarily high in Japan. And it's a complicated discussion in terms of the policies, in terms of access. But in the end, there are a lot of policies that get rid of a lot of the financial barriers to access to pre-K education in Japan. So that it's a fairly standard part of educational development in Japan that children will go to pre-K. And even if it's not as academic a pre-K, in the pre-K, there will be games that are decided for brain development. The children will be read to, the children will learn to sing. They will learn different things that help develop basic skills in real basic early numeracy, literacy, things of that sort that are going to affect their school readiness when they show up for first grade. All right. We're now going to move into more of the systemic things and the standard parts when we talk about Japanese schooling and education, which is where I'm going to sit for most of the remainder of the talk. The system in Japan is a 6-3-3 school system, starting in first grade, not starting in kindergarten. Elementary school is 6 years, junior high is 3, high school is 3. High school is not compulsory, but virtually every child, not every child, but virtually every child in Japan goes to high school and will graduate high school. And for many of the ones who don't graduate from standard high school, which is a very small percentage, they'll create night schools or alternative schools so that by the end, almost everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody in Japan will graduate from high school. Elementary and junior high school, basically what would be the equivalent in America through March of our 9th grade, because Japanese school year goes from April to March. So the equivalent of March of 9th grade in the United States is mandatory schooling in Japan. For tertiary schooling, post-high school, there are technical or specialty schools. They're supposed to teach specific skills, things of that sort. There are junior colleges, and then there's colleges and universities. One difference, there's been some movement in this in recent years, but traditionally, and even for the most part now, is you generally don't start in junior college and then transfer to a 4-year university, which would be very common in the United States. A junior college or a 2-year school, that's usually the end of your formal education, if that's the route that you choose to take. And again, very high percentages, not as high as in the United States, but very high percentages of Japanese young adults will participate in the tertiary education system. Graduate school is much less common in Japan. It's common. They have a very strong graduate education system. I'm not going to talk about it today, but it's not as common nor as required for career advancement as it would be in the United States. School attendance, without going through all these are slightly old statistics, but they haven't changed all that much now. School attendance is extraordinarily high in Japan. Absenteeism is very, very low. Chronic absenteeism is very, very low. And again, like it gets to the questions, when you see those scores, those PISA scores of strong academic achievement, then you want to be careful when your question is, why does that achievement occur? I would argue that a certain percentage of it occurs is when the kids are showing up for school at extraordinarily high rates in comparison to some other countries, not every other country in PISA, the fact of being at school every day is going to improve learning, right? That's not a very radical statement. Then there's a question of what happens once they show up. And there is a good question, which I'm not going to get into too much of, why is it that the attendance rates are so high? There's a lot of factors in that. In terms of schools, there's often a picture of Japanese schools, like every Japanese school is doing the same thing across the country. There was almost a stereotype once. It was I think it was very hurtful, not in the sense that people were hurt physically by it or emotionally, but hurtful in hurting the understanding and the portrayal of Japan, but also hurting and sometimes I think the understanding when there were times when the United States and other countries looked at Japan and said, oh, it's a great school system, what can we learn from them? As there was a misconception, there was something that went out as, if it's April 5th, every 8-year-old in Japan at 8:32 a.m. is doing the exact same thing. That's not true. There is a complex relationship between the Japanese central government, the Ministry of Education, Sports Science and Culture, and what actually happens in the schools. Not all schools in any way, shape, or form are controlled by the central government or controlled from Tokyo. But if you're thinking of it from a comparative perspective to American education, the central government in Japan has more control over schools than the central government does in the United States, number one. Number two, there is a greater level of standardization across all Japanese schools than there is standardization across schools in the United States. The way this is mostly done is through a variety of bureaucratic control mechanisms, right? One of the keys that, and I would argue there's sort of four keys to the bureaucratic control mechanisms that create standardization across Japan, or a degree of standardization, I think is a better way to put it. There is certainly variety in schools in the public school system. Certainly, if you include, there is a private or independent school system in Japan as well, and there is variety within that system. And that system is also somewhat accessible for many kids in Japan, not all kids, the independent school world there. The biggest bureaucratic control mechanism, and these all work in an interchangeable way, are what we'll call minimum standards. The Japanese government every few years will release a set of minimum standards for the grades and the subjects across Japan, as well as minimum time that every school must have. They must have like a certain number of times that history meets every year at a particular grade level. Japanese language must be taught a certain number of minutes every year in every school, things of that sort. And all kids must achieve these minimum standards, regardless of what school they are, so that if you were in third grade in Japan, these are the math things that everybody who's in third grade in Japan must read. You can go online. I mean, some of it's actually been translated to English. Certainly, if you can read Japanese, you can find it. More to the point, everyone who teaches in Japan and everyone who's an administrator in Japan, and most parents in Japan can read Japanese. You can just go on to the government websites. You can actually see what the minimum standards are for every grade in Japan, right? And certainly for graduation. And that's what they are taught to. That does create, it doesn't sort of dictate exactly what the curriculum is. It doesn't say you must teach X, Y, and Z in this particular way. But if all the students are going to meet these minimum standards of these things must be taught, that in essence, it creates an outline of a curriculum, and there will be commonalities to that outline across all schools. Now, that being said, it is not a detailed curricular map like you might see in some schools or in individual schools, say in the United States, that's going to say, okay, on the third week of school, we're going to do X, Y, Z, or in this lesson, you must do X, Y, Z lesson plan. It's more along the lines, and they will also give some timelines to help provide some guidance of here are all the topics that should be covered and things of that sort. And that creates a certain amount of commonality. A third thing that helps create a certain commonality, and this is always the question, is you could throw whatever minimum standards you want or a curriculum you want. Why should people follow it? The exam system in Japan goes a long way to creating a certain level of standardization. And this is a really important point because the exam system in Japan works, I would argue, in fundamentally different ways than standardized testing has worked in the United States, particularly required standardized testing. And the reason I really want to point this out in a comparative way is I think there was a broad misunderstanding of the way the exam system works in Japan by American bureaucrats and scholars of education. And this happened in the mid-'80s, but it is affecting us to this day in understanding how it works, and I would argue how it's effective. The exam system in Japan is basically based on a series of entrance exams, not exit exams, which also means the exams are not minimum standards exams. And I'll get in a minute how this affected American education or misunderstanding affected this. But that creates a totally different atmosphere in terms of the way schools approach the exams and the feeling towards the exams. The two big times that most Japanese students will take exams is for entrance to high school and entrance to college. There's a few other things. Most schools, you'll go to your local elementary school. With some exceptions, you will go to your local junior high school. Within high schools, in most places, sometimes it's citywide, often it's prefecture-wide. Prefecture are more or less the equivalents of states. You can go to any school with any public school within your prefecture. But the way, for the most part, slightly oversimplified, there's some nuance, which if you actually live in Japan, you would want to know, but for our purposes, it's not that important. The way that you will end up at a high school is you'll choose which high schools you want to go to, and then you'll take an exam. Everybody in the prefecture is more or less taking the same exam for high school entrance. And based on the results of the exam, all the high schools will see the results of the exam. Kids are sorted into high schools. It's a little more nuanced than that, but that's the broad picture. But what that means is they graduate from middle school regardless of what happens on those exams. And middle schools or junior high schools are not graded on what happens in those exams. Um, and teachers are not graded or evaluated based on what happens on those exams. It's a sorting system, but it also means it's more of an achievement test than a minimum standards test in the end. However, those exams, if they're exams for the public high schools, are based on testing what is listed as the minimum standards that kids must achieve and what is in the curriculum. And so the degree to which kids have mastered those minimum standards in the curriculum and things of that sort, and I'll show you some pictures of the exams later, they're not easy, will help sort the kids so that there is a lot of pressure to follow those minimum standards and that curricular guide that is out there. It also creates a different feeling and relationship between the kids and the teachers related to the exams. Instead of it being focused on failure, or sometimes even saying, I know it is competition between the kids, it's more of a team approach. Like the kids and the teachers are in it together to help the kids do as well as they could on these exams, and to do as well as they can on the exams, they need to learn things. The other part where the bureaucratic control mechanisms are very strong is in the textbooks. And this is a really important point we'll get into later. In the textbooks, the government does not write the textbooks, especially for high schools, but the government approves the textbooks. And in theory, at least, it gets complicated. In theory, the baseline for what causes a textbook to be approved or not approved is whether the textbook is covering all the appropriate things that are outlined in the sort of nationally published curriculum, and will cover all the things that meet the minimum standards. All right. So to give you an idea, when you look at the curriculum, this is a picture. I know you all don't read Japanese, but this is a picture. This is an older version. You can see a more modern version. They're online of what the curriculum is. And what you would see is something like this. If you look up here, this is called Japanese History B, right? You can see this page 34 of a full document. Over here, it gives you a quick overview, and then it starts to go through, and you can see this. I know you can't read it, but I think you can see is it's something that's sort of outline form of this is what you would call the content to be covered. So again, it's a fairly broad content. This isn't like a detailed moment by moment what you're doing, to give you an idea. Japanese school day, I apologize, a little bit of an old version of it. They don't go to school on Saturday anymore. This is back in the old days. But the basic idea, again, is the same, is you have the days of the week, ignore the Saturday day, and you'll have the periods of the day, and it's sort of mapped out here, including break time. The reason I keep this up, even if you look at a more modern version, is the idea of what is dictated is there are minimum amounts of time that different subjects need to meet. Right, and that is very common across the country, so that there is a standardization, which works for one of the things you see. I mean, you see it in the PISA test, you hear a lot of talk about it. There are certainly gaps in achievement in Japan between top and bottom. There are certainly relationships between socioeconomics, between parents' educational level and achievement of kids, but they are muted to a degree by some of this standardization. All right. Elementary school. Here's the picture of the school lunch. In elementary school, what you will see are kids being given much more independent time to figure out how to solve problems. They are given room to fail. And then the teachers will teach skills and things of that sort and test on that. The kids also in elementary school have a tremendous amount of freedom compared to what we might think of in American school, right? Control over the classroom, not the way a lesson goes. This teacher controls the way a lesson goes, but in terms of cleaning up the classroom, in terms of, like you see here, serving the lunch, doing all these different types of things. All right, junior high school. This is during a specific activity. Generally in junior high school, what you'll see is the kids will be sitting in rows, as they will often in elementary school. There is more movement in pedagogy these days. If you went back, and this is many people's pictures of Japanese schools, and there was still a large degree of truth to this, of the teacher standing in front of the kids on the board, dictating to the kids. But you also have different formations that go on. One thing in terms of pedagogy in the schools that I to point out, is in the junior high schools and the high schools, class size is also dictated, through bureaucratic mechanisms. And the basic rule, and this very much affects pedagogy, is the way schools are budgeted and the way teachers are distributed is that the maximum size of a class in a Japanese junior high school and high school is 40 kids per class. What this means, it doesn't mean that every single high school and junior high school class in Japan is 40 kids. That's not exactly how it's organized. But what it does mean as a practice is that you take the number of kids enrolled in a class, and every grade in Japan in junior high school and high school is divided into what we'll call homerooms. Homerooms have much more meaning. And for the most part, certainly in junior high school and to a large degree in high school, not 100% in high school, kids will stay in their classroom all day. They sometimes move around a little bit for science, home economics, things of that sort. In high school, sometimes there are some more specialized classes, but for the most part, they will stay in that class. So you'll be in, like, say you're in high school, grade 1, you're in 1A, 1B, 1C. You'll pretty much stay there all day with that group of kids and have all your classes there, and the teachers rotate around. The way they decide how many classes there are is they take the number of kids there and they divide it by 40. And so say there were 240 kids in a grade, you would have 6 classes in that grade, so it would be 40 kids per class. If you had 241, then you would actually go to 7 classes and you would have slightly less, is the way they work. That's why not everyone has 40, it's a maximum of 40. But for the most part, especially in more populated areas of Japan, you're going to have somewhere between 38 and 40 kids per class in junior high school and high school. There are some exceptions. That is going to influence the way pedagogy is going to take place. There is a fair amount of still like chalk and talk that you'll see going on in a Japanese class. All right, we talked about textbooks. I wanted to give you an idea of the way Japanese textbooks looks. The Japanese textbooks are much smaller than you would think of with American textbooks. They publish them every few years, so they refresh them. They are soft cover. Depending on the grade level, either the schools purchase them every year or the kids purchase them every year. If the kids are in economic need, they will get some help from the government in purchasing the textbooks. They're not as expensive as American textbooks, which, as many of you know, can go $150, $200, $250, and you'll use them for many years. And in many schools, kids won't be able to take them home. These are generally the kids' books. They take them home, they can write in them, they keep them after they're done. They are smaller, they are shorter, but what you can see here, this is a high school Japanese textbook. This is one, it's about the Japanese invasion of China during World War II. I like to use this copy for a number of reasons, even when I'm not talking about Japanese history, is you see different things. You see a fair amount of text, that's important, and all Japanese kids are supposed to be able to read this text, including dictating, as I think many of you might know. In Japan, you have different, in the writing system, you have different types of writing. You have Chinese characters and you have a Japanese syllabary. They dictate which Japanese characters all kids should know at different ages. And those characters are certainly used, and they go through the textbooks to make sure that the characters at the appropriate age level that are in there. The other thing you will see there, though, and you see a lot of this in Japanese textbooks, is you'll see things like, you see this chart on the upper right-hand corner, all right? You will see a lot of charts in Japanese textbooks across the curriculum. And this also reflects what I would argue is an important outcome of Japanese education. There is a lot of emphasis on literacy in Japan. And when I'm talking about literacy, I'm not just talking about being able to read, but literacy across things like being able to read a chart like this. Pretty much anybody who has graduated from a Japanese high school is going to be able to read economic charts, different types of charts, graphs, things of that sort, and make sense of them, all right? Which affects the way that the society functions. So, for example, where you would see an outcome of this is if any of you ever watch a Japanese news program, I would encourage you to do it, even if you can't read Japanese, and you can actually see sometimes the NHK news. I believe you can probably find it online. They also have an English version of it. And you see the way that ideas are presented. They are presented in a way that would require a certain education level sometimes to follow the ideas that are being presented the way that are being presented. And that is a part of the Japanese education system, and I would argue the way that the textbooks are produced and the way that tests are carried out. You'd also see things like pictures, and they do learn to interpret pictures, maybe not the exact same way that a US scholar of history would do, but pictures as primary sources. Political cartoons are also included there. right? So it's not as simple. There is a certain amount of regurgitation of we're going to memorize in the Japanese educational system. That's certainly there. But I think the stereotype that Japanese education is just about drill and kill and history is just about memorizing, I think that's not quite fair and that's not quite accurate. And it doesn't give an accurate picture of what they're learning. And it also doesn't give a fully accurate picture of what they're able to do when they graduate from high school, regardless of whether they're great students or school's not really their thing. Oops, sorry. Okay, this is just another picture of a textbook. And again, another thing that you see a lot in textbooks in Japan is you will see maps that are fairly complex maps. And again, things like map reading are very important skills that are still taught in Japan. All right, the exam system. Like I said earlier, they're entrance exams, not exit exams. The two main areas you have them are for high schools and universities. And in terms of standardization for universities, what I want to throw out is the idea of something called the center test. I'll get into a minute. Juku, and I want to sort of emphasize for a moment, because it does work against a stereotype, this bottom bullet point here, which is the idea that not all students in Japan aspire to attend top universities. There is sometimes a stereotype in the United States that all Japanese students are well behaved, that all Japanese students are good students. That's not true. And there is sometimes a stereotype that almost all Japanese students will go to college or want to go to top colleges. There are a significant percentage of Japanese students that do want to go to competitive universities. There are many, many, many Japanese students who, for many different reasons, do not aspire to attend top universities. They maybe want to go to a university, but they want to go to essentially a non-competitive university with very high admissions rates, or they may not wish to attend a university at all. And often they have their eyes on this. By the time they're entering high school, where the kids are somewhat sorted, if I say that to Japanese education officials, they might push back a little bit and say that it isn't officially sorting, and that is technically true. There is a lot of sorting that goes on in Japanese high schools. And there is an understanding amongst most Japanese people within a prefecture that at least this group of high schools are the ones that the stronger students tend to go to. This group is more the middle students, and this group is students who tend to be less strong. And of course, many students who go to those high schools that tend to be less strong, many of them are not aspiring, or almost none of them are intending to attend top university, and many don't intend to go to university at all. In terms of universities, one of the keys to think about is something called the center test, because this also creates a certain standardization in the learning, especially the learning for the students who are sort of the cream of the crop, or I should just say the cream of the crop, the ones who are going to be most competitive, is to go to these the public universities in Japan. And the public universities in Japan, for the most part, are the most prestigious. There's a group of very prestigious private universities as well, but the national universities are amongst the most prestigious. They're amongst the most competitive to get into. Less so now than 30 years ago, but still to a large extent. You will often, if you're in those public universities at Tokyo University, right, Kyoto University, these wonderful national universities, it will lead to your post-university job. And often, if you're from these prestigious schools, it will lead to a very stable, relatively well-paying job. So a lot of kids want to go there. For these universities, they create something called a center test. And you can take that test. It's used in fair commonality across most of the major national universities. So, and there is sort of an outline, not of the questions on the test, but of the topics on the test. So people who are aspiring to go to the top universities will all prepare for the center test, right? The schools aren't designed just to prepare for the center test, but the schools know kids are going to this, want to take it if they're at a school where a lot of kids will do that. So the curriculum, there's a lot of curricular pressure for kids to learn what will be on the center test, regardless of how the teaching is done in school, which means that that's going to create also a certain standardization, honestly, regardless of what the schools themselves do, of what the most ambitious students in Japan are going to learn, or at least try to learn, right? I'm not going to play this here, but if any of you are teaching, this could be a fun thing to teach. This is actually, it's also about kind of stability. This is a very standard folk song that was really popular back in 1961, well before even I was born, well, Jukensei Bulu. So Jukensei is someone who is aiming to get into, is studying for university. But even today, many top students, high school students in Japan could understand it. It sort of tells, it's a funny folk song telling that story. So if you want to play that, that'd be a fun thing if you're actually teaching a class. Sorry. All right. Extra lessons. So one of the things you're going to see, I know you can't all read this, is there's two things you're going to see in Japan that help. And I'm going to do this on the top end and the bottom end of the school. One is in terms of students who are struggling, and the way the schools are organized, is there are extra lessons available, certainly at the junior high and usually high school level as well, for any kids generally struggling in classes in Japanese school. Sometimes they're voluntary, sometimes not so much. So that there is an idea that you should lift all the kids to a certain level. High school entrance exam study, all right? Schools, especially public schools, they do not do formal test preparation, all right? And often when Japanese teachers come here, right, there's a lot of schools you'll see in the United States where they'll have like SAT classes in school. I've seen that. It's a little surprising often to a Japanese teacher that you would be using school time for test preparation. The idea would be that if you complete the school curriculum, in theory, you should be prepared for entrance exams. This is a high school entrance exam. I'm going to go a minute. And this is a college entrance exam, so you can see what they look like. With high school, sorry, here's the high school entrance exam itself. I'll get back to that in a minute. But here is high school entrance exam study. What I am showing you here, though, this is not a school textbook. There are two parts of entrance exam study, and this is something where certainly money and means does have some influence on who gets into schools. This is a book that you could buy in the bookstore, or now you can buy online in Japan. That is a high school entrance exam prep book. They're not very expensive to buy these entrance exam books, but they do cost money. Almost every student in Japan who is going to be going to high school will purchase one of these high school entrance exam books to help them prepare. Depending how motivated they are or how much push they're getting from their parents, they will spend more or less time studying. But a large percentage of kids, certainly who would be in the equivalent of our late 8th, early 9th grade, in other words, the last year junior high school, will spend a lot of their time, including a decent percentage of Japanese kids will spend most of their summer vacation in their 3rd year of junior high school working on these entrance exam prep books. So although they are not produced by the government, they are preparing them for tests that are administered by the government or administered by independent schools if they're trying to go to a private high school. This is a large influence on kids' learning. Now, the other part, many of you have heard something called Juku. There's different versions of Juku, but a large part, Juku are basically these private after-school schools and summer schools that kids can go to. They are generally for-profit schools. They cost different amounts of money depending which school you go to. And their business generally is to prepare kids to do well in the entrance exams to get into the best schools they possibly can. Different kids will start going to, there are some kids who will never go to Juku or these sort of, they call them cram schools in the United States. That's not exactly what all of them are. These after school schools, these summer programs, but a decent percentage of kids will. Some will start at very young ages, some will do it the year before. And like I said, some not at all. They can be quite costly, particularly if the kids start them young. And that is somewhere else where you can get a socioeconomic differentiator in who has access to the best schools in Japan. Because the Jukus, they do charge a premium, and a big part of their sales pitch is they're going to say what high schools and what colleges kids who went to their Juku got into. So the ones that tend to be more effective at preparing kids for the entrance exams are also going to tend to be more financially successful, stay in business, and that's where people will tend to send their kids. So that's a definite part of the education system. That's not the public part. Here's the high school entrance exam itself. Again, I know most of you can't read this and you can't see it, but if you saw it, what you'd see when you read it is some of these, there are written parts, are also multiple choice, but even the multiple choice, if you actually read these, most of these are actually not straight recall. They're questions, they're, I would say, a little bit easier than if you're familiar with like a US AP history exam and the multiple choice that takes place on the AP exams, where you would need to know and have memorized certain information, but generally, not exclusively, the question isn't who was the first president of the United States. You might need to know something like that, or who was the first prime minister of Japan in the Meiji era or something like that. You might need to know that, but then would have you to apply it as well. And it's notable that you would also see things here like little charts. You'll see these are essentially primary sources, political cartoons, again, more charts, is the ability to have this type of basic literacy is part of what is being tested in the entrance exams. College entrance exams are harder. They can also include writing. All right. I'm just going to quickly go through a few other things, and then I want to leave a little bit of time for questions because there's lots of other different things you might want to that you might be interested in learning about Japanese schools. There are common experiences, and I think you'll see this in the film that I would never say every child, so we'll take that caveat. Almost every child in Japan will experience, and this helps them develop skills. It also helps them develop, like part of education is to educate them on math, history, science, things of that sort. But part of education, I would argue this is part of education in any culture, is to teach them to become a member of the society in which they're learning. And these common experiences that almost everybody in Japan will have growing up is part of learning to be Japanese, right? I mean, you'll see some of that in the film. There's a great book, I forget the author from, this was 30 years ago, called Learning to be Japanese. That is all about it. That is still worth a read. It's not like some of it's dated, but some of it's still in place. All Japanese children go on school trips on their schools, or almost all. And in these school trips, you know, it has to be age appropriate. Some of it is adult run, but the kids are usually given, depending on their age, a fair amount of responsibility for organizing at least parts of the trip and behaving in certain ways on the trip. And that's done consciously to teach independence, right? What things do you need in your backpack? Of course, the teacher's going to check if they're in third grade or fifth grade that they all have that, right? Where do you want to go on the activity? Can you make the map? All those different things are part of it. There's also things in community education. I won't spend much time here, but like this is a sign telling you how to go kind of wash your hands and wash your mouth and purify yourself before going to a shrine in Japan, so that regardless of your religious background, everyone in Japan will learn this. And I know, obviously, I'm sorry, it's in Japanese, so you can't read it. But part of this is also about the politeness of you do it in this way so that it will be set up in a certain way for the next person who wants to use the same materials, which I would argue is also an important part of Japanese education, right? Sometimes people will say, and it's almost a stereotype, oh, in Japan, people are so polite, right? I wouldn't say it's like Japanese people are hardwired to be polite, but there is a conscious education of thinking about other people, thinking about people around you, learning to work effectively in a group, learning to work in a hierarchy, because hierarchies are very important in Japan. That is part of Japanese school life and community education. Right here you see high school. Part of it is also like you see the school uniforms, some are getting them, but also club activities. An important part of schools in Japan is Japanese schools, and I appreciate that. I appreciate when our Japanese schools, and now I actually teach at a boarding school, which is a very new thing to me from my middle age. And it's something actually we do in boarding schools as well, is a huge emphasis on belonging. There's a huge emphasis on finding ways for kids to feel a part of the group and that they're a part of the school and part of a community in Japan, and thinking about the whole child, in addition to sort of some of the drill and kill that goes on, right? Baseball clubs are an important part of it. You can be a lousy athlete and still be in the club, and you're an important member of the club. The other thing with the club is the way clubs are run, not exclusively, like the top ones, the adults play a stronger role, but a lot of the clubs are very, very student run. So it was shocking to me the first time I went to a Japanese school, and it was like all these kids were playing all these sports and there was no adult in the room, which in the US, like we wouldn't even do that. We'd be afraid we'd get sued. And we could get sued in the US. It gives the older kids a lot of responsibility for running the programs for the younger kids, which is part about teaching hierarchy, and hierarchy can be good and bad. It's part of that. It's also teaching about things like leadership and things of that sort. I'll just throw this out there, and I'm going to talk about that. I think it is important to look at statistics for Japan. You can get a lot of statistics about Japanese society and Japanese school in English from the Japanese Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Communication Statistics Bureau. That is an excellent site. It's also, if you are teaching numeracy or history or social studies or anything like that, you can get a lot of raw data that your kids can manipulate and learn important skills about data manipulation and what you can and can't understand about using data. And what data the government is choosing to collect and how they're collecting it. It's all out there and it's all translated into English. You can also find out on the Ministry of Education website a lot. They've translated a fair amount of it these days into English, so you can get a lot of stuff there. Family structure obviously affects it. Gender affects it. I'm just going to end here because I know we're running a little long. Just some key family statistics that go on there. The divorce rate in Japan, which is something, you know, Again, these are things that are indirect, is about 35% now. That's higher than it was a number of years ago. It used to be down in the 20s. Um, Houses where there's only one caretaker and a child are approximately 7%. That has large societal effects. It has effects on the children, has effects on the adults living there. But one thing I do want to throw out there is having a one caretaker and a child is not equivalent to the rate of single parent households, because in Japan, particularly in rural areas, a lot of people who are single parents will be living with an older generation for help with childcare. Three generation households in Japan are about 11%, which is lower than it used to be, just in terms of where kids are coming from. All right, so I will stop sharing. I am happy to share. There's a lot more material there, but I don't know what your interests are. If it's about pedagogy, if it's about how teachers are trained, relations between administrators and things of that sort, how testing works. I'm happy to answer any questions any of you have. Or I could talk more, but I'd rather just see what it is that you're all interested in. So thank you so much.